So we're going to talk a little bit about the Southern Mississippi Flyway Joint Venture Partnerships Grassland Initiative, which is a multi-joint venture effort to model full annual cycle population habitat relationships of grassland birds, or what we've been calling for short the Murmuration, which is kind of a partnership of 4 joint ventures in the southern part of the Mississippi Flyway-ish area, and the 2 universities, the University of Georgia and University of Mississippi, or University of Missouri, sorry. Building on the 3 billion birds report, there's been a lot of effort in grassland birds, and for a lot of different reasons, building over the past 25 years. As we know, the 3 billion bird report talked about the loss of 3 billion birds, but in that, a quarter of them were grassland birds, 720 million. Some species like the eastern meadowlarks have lost 3 out of 4 birds in the last 30 years since 1970. So some people are saying that grasslands are the new wetlands, and wetlands are the areas where the joint ventures have been very successful and working with partners and Fish and Wildlife Service and you know, lots of federal and state organizations to bring back duck populations to the levels that they are today, and we're trying to do the same with grassland birds. So this project is specific for an integrated population models across the flyway, and we're talking specifically about 3 species: Henslow sparrow, eastern meadowlark, and northern bobwhite. And you can see the Henslow sparrow is a watch list yellow species in the Partners in Flight assessment. Their BBS trend is negative 1.3, and you can see on the map there's a lot of red area that indicates where the populations are declining. That blue area is a lot of more recent CRP, kind of you build it, they will come sort of Henslow sparrow area, but still something to pay attention to, because over the past few years they've declined pretty much. Eastern meadowlark, like we said with the 3 billion birds report, 3 out of 4 have disappeared. They have a calculated half-life of about 23 years. So with that population estimate of 37 million, in 23 years, it'll be half that. And then in another 23 years, it'll be half that. So, and then northern bobwhite, with one of the shortest half-lives that was calculated at 10 years, the population estimate's about 5.8 million. And you can see that red on the map pretty much everywhere but the far western edge into the Playa Lakes joint venture area. So those are our 3 species that we're talking about on the breeding side. And we're gonna have these 4 joint ventures kind of working together to build these integrated population models, and we've laid out some potential study sites to do some, and Cara and Thomas will be talking about that soon. And then the other part of the story is that we also have a big portion of the wintering area for these species, and these are the eBird abundance maps for the non-breeding season. And you can see kind of this area right here, this area right in there, and then again right in here is what we're talking about, and major wintering areas for those that migrate. So in percent, for these 4 joint ventures, we're talking about eastern meadowlark, we have about 20% of the breeding area and 50% of the non-breeding population. Henslow sparrow, we have about 10% of the breeding area and almost all of the wintering area, 92%. Northern bobwhite, we have about 1 in 5 of the global northern bobwhites in this 4 joint venture area. For the Mississippi Flyway, you know, if we add in the whole north-south flyway, we're talking about half of the eastern meadowlarks, almost all of the Henslow sparrow breeding and wintering, and about a third of the northern bobwhites. So significant portions of the full annual cycle of all 3 of these birds are in these 4 joint ventures. And we also are building on existing investments in the capacities of like I said, 4 habitat joint ventures, which already have strong partnerships to help us facilitate some of the logistical support field work. We have long established science and conservation planning capabilities in all 4 of the joint ventures, proven integrated monitoring and analysis abilities. And we've been doing monitoring of different populations at different scales for a while. And the one big thing that we have that makes our project a little bit different is because we're working in joint ventures who've been building conservation delivery mechanisms that are integrated into take the science that we're trying to build and programs that are already on the ground. And finally, we have a strong project leadership team with across the 2 universities and the 4 joint ventures that have come together. And we've been talking about this project for a couple of years now in the planning stages, and we're getting to the point where we're really ready to build on the ground and move forward, especially in the light of the half-lives of these species. There's a certain urgency and ability to take the science that we produce and put it on the ground.
So to follow up, Jim kind of gave an introduction to this project and the species and the overall region. I want to describe a little bit about why we're taking this particular approach with this murmuration or this initiative in terms of this large of a project with this, a lot of sampling going on. And there's a couple things that, are kind of key to this project. Number one, it's a full annual cycle approach. And secondly, we're focusing on this idea of using integrated population models that are pretty data heavy, but we think it's worthwhile. And so let me just spend a few slides and a few minutes describing why we're taking this approach and why we think it's important. And it really kind of boils down to this reason that we may or may not think we know what grassland populations need, but either way, we kind of have to be sure because, we spend a lot of resources and we need to really try to make sure we're spending those resources effectively. And so to start out, let's start out with the obvious that yes, habitat certainly is important. I think that's been a major paradigm and continues to be for species conservation, including birds. And joint ventures and the Fish and Wildlife Service and in general has gotten very, very good at designing and delivering habitat and putting it on the ground out there. I think certainly with the Farm Bill and these other programs, we've seen, increased effectiveness there. But even with that delivery, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service acknowledges that strategic habitat conservation is very important. It's very important where we put this habitat because these populations are complex, right? There's multiple factors and interactive things going on. Even some of the work out of the joint venture that we've done with Jane has indicated this. This was a study a few years back that showed that when we randomly shotgun and restore habitat across the Central Hardwoods joint venture, we really don't see any increases, projected increases in populations of forest birds, for example, the prairie one we see here. However, when we focus that same amount of habitat restoration actually on protected areas, which happen to correspond with landscapes that are usually highly suitable and good habitat, we do see a major, reversal of declines for this particular species. And this was the same for a few other species that we modeled as well. So yes, habitat, but it's important about knowing where to put it. And right now with some of the grassland species, we don't have that kind of knowledge. At the same time, other factors can affect our ability to recover species. Here's a few good examples. The paradigm shift with, in the mid-90s, realizing that forest fragmentation was a major driver of species declines. That was kind of a revelation, right? And so it changed how we approach things. I think the DDT, example is a great example of how things that are beyond habitat really matter, and we need to be aware of, looking at those kinds of demographics as well. And then recently we did some work extrapolating some models for Acadian flycatchers in the Central Hardwoods as well, and showed that climate change is going to become a preeminent threat in the years to come for a lot of songbirds. And so this is just acknowledging that, yes, it's habitat, but we also need to look at these other demographics because in some situations they can be equally as important. And until we have an approach that can kind of consider them all, we really don't know. And so as we're trying to kind of put all this together and consider habitat as well as these other demographics, you know, it's important to kind of acknowledge that we often go back to science and modeling, and I think we're all kind of familiar with that. That's kind of be our approach to putting this all together. Modeling can be effective for that. And so I'm showing this graph here to kind of, and this graph was pulled from the report a while back that was really trying to convey the importance of farm bill conservation programs to reversing bird declines, right? And so we see the initial declines for grassland, forest, and wetland birds there, and we see the onset of these easement programs, which is really kind of relating to the idea of habitat conservation hitting full steam, right? But we see that real big, strong recovery for wetland birds, and we don't see that as much for the forest and grassland birds. Yeah, the declines were kind of, you know, reduced somewhat, but we really don't see that rebound. And I think if we're really being honest, we could look at that time period where you start to see that reversal of the wetland bird decline and realize that that was also the time where the wetland, you know, scientific community kind of took a concerted effort to put everything they had together into an adaptive harvest management modeling kind of framework to consider all aspects. And then as they learned more and more from those modeling approaches and they figured out how to manage the systems and harvest and habitat, I think that was what I'm trying to convey here, is that that really was part of the solution. You know, it's not all of it. Certainly habitat was important, but putting the scientific models together to really guide these kinds of approaches can be key, can be very, very helpful. And so that's kind of what's kind of given us our incentive to move forward with this approach. And so as Jim mentioned, we are considering these full annual cycle models because we want to look at all the demographic processes that could potentially be problematic or limiting for these three species of birds. Okay, and it just so happens that, you know, for most of these species, we have the ability to access the difference at different parts of the cycle for these birds. And so we're looking at these demographic processes such as survival during migration and on the wintering and breeding grounds, but also reproduction and also as well as dispersal, you know. And so those are the processes that we want to look at. And for all those processes, we want to be able to link it back to the habitat, you know, on the ground at those sites and across those regions, because that's going to be a key to management. And so for all those processes, if you think about what kind of data we need to collect to kind of carry out those, you know, and look at those processes, that's when we kind of look over here and we see that, yeah, we can collect those kind of data to inform those demographic processes, or at least understand what they are. And that includes adult trapping and telemetry, juvenile telemetry. We can do nest monitoring on breeding grounds. We can do point counts to get at abundances and so on. We do have some holes that are harder to get to, right? For example, survival during migration and so on, but we'll get to that in a minute. But the idea here is that if we want to take a full annual cycle approach, there's a lot of components and data that we need to collect to do that. And we kind of laid those out there. And that's what this whole project is geared to, is collecting those data. And so if we're going to put it all together too, ultimately that's going to involve some integrated population models. And I know those are all the rage right now, and they certainly should be. They're very effective. But this isn't just kind of a pie in the sky wish list here. We've actually got this planned out in a way that this approach fits nicely with the data that we envision collecting. And with integrated models, really the idea here is that you're just including multiple data sources for holistic demographic estimation, okay? And so the schematic on the right kind of shows your typical integrated model that is incorporating reproductive data, survival data, and abundance data over time in a way that can be conditional, that they are conditional on each other. And you can see here where I've kind of filled in the spaces where the data that I just showed you on the previous slide is going to inform those models in an integrated approach. And so once we put these together, then what we can do is it gives us the assessment of population size and trajectory, but then we can also model and understand the demographics specifically. We can also describe the ecological processes that are generating those demographic patterns. And all that means is that we can start to understand exactly what the habitat or landscape, you know, ecological processes are that are, you know, driving lower survival, for example, or lower reproduction. And with that information, then we can start to make some decisions about management. Here is just a follow-up slide to show kind of how this process works in an integrated model. And you guys have probably seen, versions of this from different, different outlets. But all we're doing is we're modeling productivity and survival and abundance and counts, but we're doing so within essentially the same equation. So that way we start to get an idea where things agree and don't agree, and overall we start to paint a better picture that really kind of gives us a robust and precise estimate of what the population is doing over time, what our uncertainty is about it. But just as important is we can start to look at the individual demographics going on under the hood. And so by estimating all these parameters simultaneously and conditionally, we can start to look at where things don't line up, don't make sense. And that starts to point us into areas where maybe we need to dive in with more research. But more than likely, it's going to allow us to kind of identify some of the problems. In particular, one thing that's nice is we mentioned that we may not get at survival for migration. But if we have all these data to inform all these other vital rates, and even if one data set is missing, for example, the spring migration survival, we can infer that from the patterns from all the others. And that's kind of what we're displaying here. This is kind of conditional reconciling. If fecundity is like this over time and breeding survival is like this, and we see a population growth or decline like such and such, well, then that must mean that migration survival exists. We start to play those games back and forth on each other to understand where are our demographics really limited. Here's an example of the increased precision or accuracy. And this is just simulated data to kind of drive home this point. And what you see here are some graphs that show estimates of these different demographics from an independent model and an integrated model. The independent model will be if we just model counts from a data set by themselves, or we just model reproduction over time on its own without looking at survival or abundance or anything else. The blue integrated results show what if we estimated those same data, but all in an integrated model. And what you can see with this graph here is that we start to get a much more precise and higher resolution picture of what's going on and changing over time. But down in that survival graph, it's in particular, if you compare the juvenile survival estimates from the independent approach to the juvenile integrated, the juvenile estimates from an integrated model, you can see that we identified there that there was a serious source of bias that would have been, come into our estimates of juvenile survival had we not integrated it and, conditioned it on all the other data we have. And this makes sense, right? You get a better picture of for each individual aspect if we put it all together and look at it in light of everything else. And that's really what we're trying to convey. So recently, a grad student here at the University of Missouri, who's now a postdoc with me under the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, she finished up her PhD, and this is a great example of an integrated model focused on grassland birds. And so she looked at northern bobwhite brood ecology and population dynamics in the Southwest Missouri. And really what her project, the objectives of her project were to evaluate site-specific seasonal survival, fecundity, and population growth of bobwhite on extensive native grasslands and traditionally managed conservation areas. And so she had a few years of intensive telemetry sampling and habitat sampling to track these birds. And once she put it together in an integrated model, some of the takeaways that she found were that on these sites, population growth rates were most strongly correlated with non-breeding season survival. Okay? Juvenile survival was highest on native grasslands that were burned and grazed at least once in 2 years. She also found that successful broods selected for shrub cover in areas farther from trees. And really why I'm showing you this example is this was a kind of a local site-level population integrated model. And look at the takeaways that she found from just that small project. The idea here is, wouldn't it be really nice if we could take the same approach and scale it up to regions and start to look and try to get some results that give us this kind of information, but just across regions and landscapes that could start to inform our management at that scale. And that's really kind of what's driving our emphasis here. With that, I'll shift over to Cara, who will talk a little more specifically about the project setup.
Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to start by talking about why this research needs to be done at the proposed scale and scope, and how this is the most efficient and effective approach. Currently, data does not exist that can tie reproductive and survival rates to habitat in a way that can help to refine habitat management in our 4JV region. Having demographic data collected together with habitat sampling in both winter and summer of the same year reduces the amount of unexplained variation, while using existing data from literature and public data sets like the Breeding Bird Survey, MAPS, and eBird incorporates unexplained variation due to year and geography. While our proposed method of collecting data that is linked spatially and temporally, there will be less hand-waving in the interpretation of the results, and our results are specific to the region sample. Further, this method allows a much more centralized and consistent coordination of data collection. As the research will be coordinated by the Central Hardwoods joint venture, the data collection will be consistent and compatible across all study sites, and the 4 joint ventures will work together to collect the data needed to develop specific data to develop full annual cycle models. This allows us to capture a range of ecological variation and get a more holistic assessment of where things may be limited and where things are doing okay. And finally, this approach allows us to have faster implementation. Since our results are already tied to habitat, we can therefore inform conservation planning with this data. And so as soon as this project is done, we will have the information we need to refine our ongoing implementation efforts. And as Jim said earlier, joint ventures already have a mechanism in place to implement what is needed to remove the limiting factors. And so we as JVs are in a unique position to do this research and also apply the results. Okay, so Tom talked about the data needs for integrated population models. And so the first 3 data needs are seasonal survival, productivity, and an annual count. And so I'm going to talk about that. In addition to this, in order for the results to inform that on the ground habitat management, we need to collect data in the field. So collect habitat characteristic data in the field, as these kinds of data are necessary to make the fine resolution connections like Emily Sinnett's research found. So that those findings that Tom presented at the end of his talk. And further, to ensure that these data represent a full range of variation across all joint ventures of habitat variation, our study sites must represent regional variation in land cover and climate across all 4 joint ventures, which is throughout the Flyway, and also across the latitude and longitudinal variation, as well as across ecoregions. And finally, we need to know where existing populations overlap and where we can work. And so since we have both resident species and partial migrant species and a full migratory species, most sites can be used for both wintering and breeding. But we need to find out where those opportunities exist and overlap with where we have access to work. So what study sites we can do the work at. And so to start with, we started with working with eBird raw data. So this is records that the public has reported of where these 3 species populations already exist. And so, and by overlapping these records with each other, so looking at where do reports of Henslow sparrows, meadowlarks, and bobwhite overlap, but also where these overlapping areas further overlap public land and Northern Bobwhite Conservation Initiative focal areas. And so those are what we started with, and we've settled on these 13 right now potential study sites, which will likely be pared back hopefully to 12. And so again, each site generally has eBird records of at least 2 species, because it was not possible to find 12 sites with all 3 species in all seasons. And we chose sites with a range of observation frequency, not just sites that had very high abundances or high number of reports, because we assume that the abundance, this raw assessment of abundance, is also a rough assessment of habitat quality. And it's really important that our study sites reflect a range of habitat quality, as well as all these other variations that I've already repeated over and over. And so, again, these sites are on public land or Northern Bobwhite Conservation Initiative focal areas. And we've captured a large range of variation at this rough scale, as you can see by looking at how the land cover varies in this NLCD land cover that's in this figure, that you can even see some BCR boundaries and joint venture boundaries just by the distribution of these land cover types. And this is, just to be clear, I've reclassified NLCD to reflect land cover that's important specifically to this project. And even though we are collecting data on public land, our results can still be applied to private lands conservation, because our study design is specific to allowing us a regional and not just a local inference. And so this careful planning allows for us to apply these results across any land cover within our region. And so moving on to field methods, Tom introduced these earlier. And so we will be using radio telemetry to measure adult and juvenile survival, as well as nest location and nest and brood monitoring in order to measure productivity. And along with these efforts in the field, so the radio telemetry and the nest monitoring, we will be collecting habitat measures. So habitat selection will be estimated by sampling habitat in conjunction with all of these. And again, I just want to emphasize the importance of sampling habitat on the ground simultaneously with these metrics at multiple scales. So at the points or the nest or the brood, as well as at the field and the study site, because these demographic measures may be responding to these measures of habitat characteristics at multiple scales, not just at the point. And so the habitat sampling design will focus on metrics that are most relevant to informing on-the-ground management and conservation planning. And so again, the goal of the scope of the study design is to have all of the information necessary to identify where in the annual cycle species are limited and how habitat management can help remove the limiting factors without having to wait for more data collection to start implementation. Okay, and so finally, I wanted to briefly introduce and touch on the budget necessary to carry this out at the scope and scale. So this project does require a substantial short-term investment, but it will make conservation efforts more efficient, effective, and therefore less expensive overall in the long run. So for example, the Oaks and Prairies and Central Hardwoods joint ventures respectively have a $6 million and a $4.5 million NRCS RCPP awards to do grassland conservation on private lands. And the conservation footprint and scope of impact for both of these projects is much smaller than the proposed scope of effect anticipated from this proposal with a similar or even smaller budget. We believe our research and modeling outcomes will inform conservation across the four joint venture region and possibly beyond for decades to come. As Tom discussed, waterfowl recovery shows that the investment in conservation is effective when it is informed by science. We know the unprecedented financial commitment to the science that successfully drove waterfowl conservation was worth it, and grassland birds are worth the investment as well. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you and pass it on.
Yeah, so over the past couple of years, we've been talking about this and trying to figure out ways to get it funded and what it's going to look like when it goes on the ground and how much it's going to cost. And we've gotten pretty far down the road of thinking about, you know, to adequately inform the conservation efforts and to do the science that we want to do. What's it going to cost for transmitters, receivers, and personnel, and nest searching, which is super people and time intensive to track and count, and then do winter parts of the study, and for 12 sites over the area. And when you start calculating all those pieces, here's some of the main pieces of the budget: the equipment and personnel and housing and transportation, which is always a big one. The total amount comes up to about $4 million, $4.5 million about, but that's over 3 years, over 12 sites. Sounds like a lot, but then if you compare it to what we've been investing in conservation delivery, just in some of the partnerships that we have with NRCS through their Regional Conservation Partnership Program. The Oaks and Prairies has a $6 million partnership over 5 years with the NRCS, and Central Hardwoods has an $8 million partnership. And that doesn't necessarily include all the partner staff time that goes into conservation delivery on the ground. So we're backing up what we're spending now on delivery that doesn't have these kind of looking back at the science and modeling support. Some of it is supported, but this certainly would make that much stronger. And we're best positioned right now to take the science, take the modeling that we're talking about, and directly apply it to conservation programs on the ground. So we're looking for support for this $4.5 million price tag right now. And we've got a few things that we've been looking at, a few possible grant areas that we can explore, but any kind of support we can get would be helpful. If anybody has any questions?